Hi, today we will talk about the history of Miami. It is always boring to read and get information. I tried to tell you briefly from the beginning to today about the history and founders of such a beautiful city of Miami in the state of Florida. Well, have a nice view and let's go. Before the arrival of Europeans, the area where Miami is now located was inhabited by the Tequesta Indian tribe, who lived in much of the southeastern part of the peninsula, including present-day Miami-Dade, Broward, and southern Palm Beach counties. The tribe engaged in fishing, hunting, and gathering wild fruits and roots, but never practiced agriculture. The first European to visit the area was Spanish conquistador Juan Ponce de León, who sailed into Biscayne Bay in 1513. His records indicate that he visited Tequesta, English Chequesha, which was the first name of Miami. It is not known for certain at this time whether de León went ashore and met with the locals. In the same area until the mid-18th century, a small tribe of Miami, from whom the name of the city was later derived, lived. The first known white man to land on this coast was Pedro Menéndez de Aviles, who with his crew visited the settlement of Tequesta in 1566 in search of his son, who had been shipwrecked in the area the year before. The first permanent European settlements in southern Florida appeared in the early 1800s. People came from the Bahamas in search of treasure from ships that ran aground in the waters of the Great Florida Reef. Some of them settled on Spanish possessions along the Miami River. Around the same time, Seminole Indians, including escaped black slaves, appeared in these territories. The conflicts resulted in the so-called Second Seminole War, in which Major William Harney led several expeditions to dislodge the Indians. The war was one of the most devastating in American history, resulting in the near extermination of the Miami area's Indian population. After the end of the Second Seminole War in 1842, William English re-established the colony on the banks of the Miami River, founded by his uncle. He mapped the village of Miami on the south bank of the river and sold several parcels of land. In 1844, the township became the county seat, and 6 years later, a survey showed 96 residents. The Third Seminole War, 1855-1858, was not as devastating as the second, but it slowed settlement development in southeast Florida. By the end of the war, only a few soldiers lived there. In 1891, a wealthy woman named Julia Tuttle from Cleveland, Ohio, bought up a huge citrus plantation, expanding on a small tract of land she had inherited from her father. Thus, the area of her new holdings became about 640 acres. Before this event, in 1886, her husband died, and she decided to move to Florida for the health of her children. Tuttle tried to persuade railroad magnate Henry Flagler to extend his Florida East Coast Railway to Miami, but was rebuffed. Miami Tower. During the winter of 1894, Florida experienced several unusually cold days, and as a result, virtually the entire citrus crop was destroyed. The only area that was not affected by the frost was the Miami area, and Tuttle Plantation was the only one whose fruit was able to reach the American market. Tuttle approached Flagler again, and he decided to extend the railroad line to Miami and build a resort hotel there. On April 7, 1896, the road was built, and on April 13th, the first train arrived in Miami with Flagler himself on board. The first regular rail service to Miami was opened on April 15, 1896. Miami was officially granted city status on July 28, 1896, with a few hundred residents at the time. A vote at a consolidation meeting was taken to give Miami city status. All male residents of Miami itself and Dade County were eligible to vote. Following the affirmative resolution, steps were taken to nominate a city council, give the official name, the City of Miami, and define the boundaries of the city. The first residents of the City of Miami were 444 people. Up until the beginning of World War II, the city grew at an astronomical rate. In 1900, the city had 1,681 81 residents. In 1910, 5 out of 471. In 1920, 29,571. And in 1930, 110,637. Due to the fact that to the west of Miami ran the Everglades wetlands. Beginning in 1906, several canals were built to drain the overly moistened area. In the early 1920s, the authorities allowed gambling in the city and stopped paying attention to the then existing in the U.S. dry law. And as a result, thousands of immigrants from the northern part of the country began to move to the city. However, the devastating hurricane that swept through Miami in 1926, killing 373 people, suddenly halted the city's rapid population growth. Between 25,000 and 50,000 people became homeless as a result of the disaster. In addition, during the Great Depression, 16,000 people in the Miami area lost their earnings by losing their jobs. On February 15, 1933, in Bayfront Park in Miami, an assassination attempt was made on U.S. President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was giving a speech. The gunman was Italian anarchist Giuseppe Zangara. As a result of the incident, Chicago Mayor Anton Joseph Cermak, who was near the president, was killed, and 4 other people were wounded. But the president himself was not injured. Zangara was immediately arrested and later executed. By the early 1940s, the city had slowly recovered from the Great Depression. In 1940, the city already had about 172,000 people. But then, World War II broke out. Unlike other Florida cities, the financial damage from the outbreak of the war did not hit Miami as hard. About 500,000 enlisted men and 50,000 officers were training in South Florida. Many of them settled in Miami at the end of the war, causing a dramatic increase in population to nearly 250,000 by 1950. After Cuban President Fulgencio Batista y Saldivar was overthrown in the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and Fidel Castro came to power, many Cubans living in Miami returned to their homeland. Soon afterward, however, the situation changed, and many middle-class Cubans began to immigrate to Miami. In 1965 alone, some 100,000 Cubans issued airline tickets for flights from Havana to Miami. By the late 1960s, more than 400,000 Cuban refugees had already settled in Miami-Dade County. In December 1979, Miami experienced some of the worst ethnic riots in U.S. history. The case began when a Black American man violated speed rules on a highway and died while fleeing from a police officer on his motorcycle. Although the police report indicated that the man crashed to death, the findings of pathologists and the testimony of other witnesses showed that the motorcyclist was beaten to death by the policeman. The ethnic riots that erupted left 10 African Americans and 8 whites dead and 850 people arrested. Damages amounted to about $1 million. In 1980, a massive Cuban exodus to Miami, dubbed the Mariel Boat Lift, brought some 125,000 new Cuban immigrants to the city. Unlike previous waves in the 1960s, this time most of the refugees belonged to the poor. With the massive arrival of immigrants, the city simultaneously began to be abandoned by local white, middle-class, non-Spanish-speaking residents. While in 1960, the white non-Spanish-speaking population made up 90% of the city's total population, by 1990 that percentage had fallen to less than 12%. Also in the 1980s, the city saw an increased flow of immigrants from other countries in the region, such as Haiti. An entire neighborhood of concentrated Haitian population was formed in the city around the intersection of 2nd Avenue and 54th Street, dubbed Little Haiti. In the 1990s, signs written in Haitian appeared on the streets. This language, along with the official English and Spanish, was used on the ballot. Another wave of Cuban immigration occurred in 1994. Fearing further uncontrolled growth in immigration, the administration of U.S. President Bill Clinton announced a major change in U.S. immigration policy. It was announced that Cubans found in U.S. territorial waters would be redirected by patrol boats to Guantanamo Bay or Panama instead of U.S. territory. Since the summer of 1994, more than 30,000 Cubans and 20,000 Haitians have been intercepted at sea in the first 8-month period alone. According to the 2000 census, more than 362,000 people lived in the city itself, and 5.4 million if counted with the suburbs. Hurricane Andrew, which swept through Miami-Dade County in 1992, was the second most destructive hurricane in U.S. history. It caused more than $45 billion in damage and killed 65 people. In 2017, Hurricane Irma flooded the center of Miami and left most of the city without electricity, breaking more than 80% of all high-voltage wires.